Bitcoin was famously created as a reaction to the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. The individual or organization known as Satoshi Nakamoto envisaged a peer-to-peer system of finance where individuals could transact business without the need for corrupt intermediaries. But is that vision true today? For all the talk of decentralization, the blockchain is run by a handful of oligopolies: BCG, FTX, Coinbase, Binance. They run major sections of the space. Yuga Labs dominates the NFT space. There are over 20,000 cryptocurrencies, but Bitcoin and Ethereum dominate the bulk of the headlines. Is decentralization actually a myth? My next guest, Bud White, will help shed some light on this provocative topic. Bud, welcome to Daily Drop.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
See you again.
Fellow Canadian, too.
Yeah.
Let's start at the beginning with decentralization. Why is decentralization so important to the blockchain?
I think you nailed it already. It comes down to democratizing the ability for a person or entity to transfer value. If I am a farmer, I have a season's worth of crop, I need to transfer that into a store of value, use that store of value to maybe purchase something from you. No company, government, or entity should be able to block me from using that store of value. That was the ethos behind why Bitcoin in the beginning.
Right. Do you think that's still true today?
I still think it's true today. There are a number of use cases where people want to flee conflict zones or repatriate capital somewhere where it may be difficult to do it through traditional financial rails. And we are seeing utility of Bitcoin, of Ethereum, of other cryptocurrencies to do exactly that very basic use case of transferring value to one person or another.
All right, let's be very blunt, just in terms of like a pros, cons, right? Let's start with the pros. Like, what are the benefits of decentralization?
Speed. It moves much quicker than wire transfers. Fewer gates. You can't block it like a wire transfer. And I would say the ability for all parties to have transparency. So if I'm making a transfer to you, everybody else can validate that it's true, therefore it actually happens.
Okay, so cons, like what are the drawbacks of decentralization?
Huge activation energy to get into the asset class.
What do you mean by that, activation energy?
Teaching people, one, the actual workflow of using it. For example, I have my parents, they want to get into the asset class. I have to teach them how to wire money to a place to purchase it, do the purchase, teach them about wallets so they can secure their asset, and then teach them how to send. None of that is intuitive today, like all of the transfer mechanisms for traditional fiat capital, like PayPal and Venmo. Okay,
but is that more a byproduct of the technology, or is that a byproduct of decentralization? Because that sounds like it's more like the tech of it.
I think it's about the tech, right?
Right.
The tech, it's been around for more than 10 years, but it's still in its infancy when it comes to the amount of time and resources spent on the user experience of using it. So I think with enough time and companies solving these problems, we'll be able to get people like my parents using crypto, no problem.
It's interesting talking to you, right? Because it's like there's really more than one problem at the same time, right? There's a problem of learning the technology, and there's a problem in terms of decentralization, where it's really like a new way to conceive of the world, especially if you think about Web 2. Like Web 2, people now, they know the technology, but it's very centralized, and they're kind of used to it. Mm-hmm. And decentralization, especially with the blockchain, it's just a completely new way to think.
It is. I think the large corporations of the Web 2 era, the Googles, the Facebooks, the LinkedIns, we've been trained as a population to trust them. I remember 25 years ago when I got my first Gmail account, I thought it was so special. And I thought that, why would I ever not want to use Google in the future? Then they started using my Google account to do authentication for other services under this guise of, we'll own your identity, and we'll let you tie into your PayPal account, your eBay account, your every other kind of account. And I always felt very secure that Google was doing that for me. And the ethos of Web3 is, well, yes, there are they enabled a lot of workflows in the Web2 internet, but the price you pay is your data being available, them being able to market to you in ways that maybe you don't want to, or for them to be able to shut off access to your identity in a way that can really cause you pain and grief.
See, this is perfect, and that'll segue nicely into our next section about corporations, and we're going to talk about that more when we get back. Daily Drop. Welcome back to the Daily Drop. We're here with Bud White. We're a real high-level convo. We're talking about corporations, oligopolies, all the things in the space. And look, if we're being honest, a few oligopolies have emerged in Web3. And why does nobody talk about this?
I think everyone's caught up in the hype, right? Most people are trying to jump onto a rocket ship and trying to figure out which one, not really thinking about the impact of what these large conglomerates are doing in the space.
It's a big issue, though, right? Because decentralized ethos is the cornerstone of the entire blockchain space. So the whole point is it's supposed to be without intermediaries. But if you have these oligopolies, if you have a small handful of players dominating everything, isn't that go against the spirit of what he's trying to do?
I think so. I think there are examples of good and bad oligopolies, right? So if you look on the FTX side, FTX grew rapidly, faster than any other exchange. They put themselves in a position to help failing projects during the, let's say, trust crisis that we had in crypto over the last 6 months. Sam was able to go in and pick up, I believe it was BlockFi and a few other products, where BlockFi offered a product that people wanted, a yield-generating account. They ended up going almost insolvent, and Sam came in and picked them up. But on the other end, you've got large organizations like Yuga Labs, which are dominating the NFT and metaverse markets. In the course of, I think it's 13 or 15 months between the NFTs they launched, the metaverse, the central raising of capital, they created about $10 billion worth of value, which is unheard of. I think everybody is rooting for them to win, but I'm also very weary that they have the ability to execute, especially with so many eyes on them.
Yeah, look, and I agree completely. And look, I'm not a hater for any particular organization. I just think that if the entire space is set up in a way where really nobody's supposed to be in charge, but you have a few people who are clearly whales in the space, who really dictate the pace, I don't know, it seems problematic to me. But look, speaking of whales in the space, corporations, people with a lot of power, some of the biggest corporations in the world, Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, I mean, these are key investors for Web3. Like, do you think this is a conflict of interest?
I think that the investment capital has to come from somewhere. There's been an immense generation of wealth within crypto, but it pales in comparison to what we've seen in tech, right? And the tech equities that are offered on public exchanges. So take a look at what happened in Canada over the last 15, 20 years. When I was in my undergrad, there was one venture capital firm that was investing in tech companies in Canada. So all of us entrepreneurs had to either go down to Silicon Valley to start companies or take our Canadian companies down there to entice some capital, bring it back to Canada, build companies, and the entrepreneurs of that generation have taken their own wealth and started more venture capital in Canada. They've kind of kickstarted this cycle of one generation of entrepreneurs seeding the next generation and so on. Same thing has to happen in crypto. For a new asset class, there are no large investors that are willing to create venture capital funds. So we've had to go elsewhere. Seeing Andreessen Horowitz, for example, be the lead in Yuga Labs Series A, it does worry me. As a tech company owner and operator, when I see, Andreessen Horowitz's Fund 3 come through with the billions on offer in investment, it does entice me. But I would love to see, for example, FTX putting a fund together, right, and taking money from crypto entrepreneurs rather than outside of crypto entrepreneurs.
That segues really nicely to my next question, right? Because it's not like corporations are necessarily bad, but they do change the temperature, right? Like, do you think corporations legitimize or contradict the space?
I think any institution that's trying to get into the asset class legitimizes it. And I say this both large centralized organizations that have venture funding arms, as well as venture capital companies, as well as hedge funds and banks that want to get into the asset class. If there is a demand for the asset, these finite assets that we've created, the price will go up. And as the price goes up, we've seen speculation go up and crash back down, go up, crash back down. But what happens every time the price goes up, the number of active wallets goes up. And to me, that means there's more utility value in the network. So every time we see this sawtooth, there's a continual growth of people who are using or have the ability to use crypto. We talked about that activation energy, that difficulty.
Let's get more into it after the break, and we'll be back with the Daily Drop. Welcome back to the Daily Drop. I'm here with Bud White. Okay, so Bud, let's talk about CBDCs, right? So most large central banks are launching central bank digital currencies. What do you think about that? Do you think that this is just a way for central banks to control cryptocurrency?
Well, let's remember how stablecoins came about, right? There was this need for a way to digitally represent cash when you were bringing it from one exchange to another without doing wire transfers, right? So Tether was the first big, USDT was the first big stablecoin. And it really transformed the way that people trade on exchanges or can move their capital from exchange to exchange. So stablecoins overall, net good for the crypto industry.
Definitely.
CBDCs, okay. Well, the question of who and why and how to think about this comes down to a trade-off between trust and privacy for each of the individual users or purchasers of this asset class. If you look at, for example, the Terra Luna meltdown, right? What we saw is a stablecoin that was algorithmically stabilized, right? And a lot of people jumped on trusting the founders that the algorithm would work, right? Obviously, people found a hole in that, exploited that hole, the whole system came crashing down. So why central banks? Trust. Do you trust the algorithm of the Terra Luna projects? Well, I didn't. Tether's been the longest standing and most used stablecoin. There have been few audits of the custody account, even though if you look on any blockchain explorer, they are by far the most used by volume.
Let me just cut in here. This is interesting what you're saying, because really, you're really comparing central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, to stable coins. Mm-hmm. So do you think that essentially that's what the CBDCs are attempting to do? They're really looking 100%. To replicate the stable coin ethos.
100%, yeah. And the point I want to make is what central banks bring to the table is the highest level of trust for a centralized institution. Because now, as a user of that CBDC or stablecoin, I don't have to trust an algorithm. I don't have to trust a group of developers in a garage. I don't have to trust a bank or a trust-regulated institution. I'm now trusting a central government. So for my digital dollar to fail, the government has to fail. So if the Canadian government or the US government steps up and says, we want to do a CBDC, I think it's net good. Even though overall I'm against centralization, I think if we had to trust somebody, we want to trust somebody who's at the top of the trust pyramid.
It's interesting what you're saying. You're actually taking this segment in a different direction, but in a good way. Okay, so I do have another question that's very related to what you said, because we're talking about trust. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so in China, right, they've banned all cryptocurrency. They've launched their own CBDC, and apparently they're actually tracking their private citizens' data through these CBDCs. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about trust. Okay, so I buy the argument for sure. We're going to trust a central bank over someone that you don't know, especially when there's issues, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, if the governments have even more power over you, what could they do with that power?
That's a scary thing, right? And the trade-off is trust for privacy, right? One of the things that we do at Tacen amongst building our exchange is we're a part of the Blockchain Association lobbyist group in Washington, D.C. So we're working with policymakers to make sure that that boundary of privacy is not crossed with the proposed US CBDC. we can look at all of the negative impacts, the surveillance impacts that we see in China, and we 100% in North America do not want that to happen. There are ways to bake in the way that you issue, regulate, and track to still give citizens and users of these assets privacy while maintaining the ability to trust the issuer, which is a government, a country-sized government.
Well, look, and we have less than a minute, so we'll have to be brief. But I mean, it's scary too because it's like people already don't understand the technology, so they don't necessarily know what they're signing up for. It's like, oh, that sounds good. Instead of Tether, I never heard of Tether. I know the government. I'll use them, but what are you signing up for, right?
I find it sometimes hard to actually differentiate when I break it down to like the basic units of what happens when you think about how the US dollar or the Canadian dollar is issued versus how a CBDC would be issued. Ultimately, they're going to be issued the same way. And other than having
let's
paper.
Let's get into that more after the break. Sure. I appreciate everything that you're doing, but we'll be back on the Daily Drop. Welcome back to the Daily Drop. Okay, let's talk about centralized versus decentralized. Okay, like the future. So, do you think the future is a compromise? Like, do you think it's going to have to be a little bit of this and a little bit of that, or do you think that this is a war where the two camps are going to be at each other's throats like forever?
I don't see it as a compromise. I see it as a gradient, where on one end you have full decentralization, and on the other hand you have centralized entities running parts of the network. And I have different needs and you have different needs and everyone has different needs. So for example, if I want to transfer you value, right, send you Bitcoin, I want that to be fully decentralized. That is, in Satoshi's original vision, the thing that should be untouched by any entity. But if I need to bridge real world assets into the blockchain, that by default has to have some sort of centralized entity acting as an oracle bringing that in. Whether it's CBDCs, whether it's creating equity and bringing that onto the blockchain. There are functions where you're going to inherently need to trust some centralized entity or decentralized entity. It could be a DAO or a group. But the different functions, I think, fall in. So just like you have different levels of protection on your passwords for websites, your bank password is probably the most secure. Your Facebook, maybe not so much. I view the choice of the level of decentralization really pinned to what the act you're trying to do is.
I mean, look, I agree with you, but I mean, there are definitely people in the Web3 ecosystem that hate centralization. Like when they say centralization, like centralized, like there's like it's like eating poison or something, so I guess I just don't know, how's that conflict going to be resolved? Like, there's always going to be very unhappy people with the centralized components of the ecosystem.
There is, and I don't know if we could get away from it. Like, I'll give you an example. I spoke to Kane, the original founder of Synthetics in Australia. He started his business trading crypto options as a centralized business, and as he progressed, he was one of the first companies that went from centralized to fully decentralized. And if you look at what he's doing today, it's a great model for how to become fully decentralized, but he did sacrifice a lot. The way the companies run, the way that corporate actions work for the stakeholders, it's not fully thought out yet. So I think even the anarchist decentralists still acknowledge that, there is still need for some centralization.
It's interesting because, like, if you I find sometimes, because I'm on Twitter like all the time, following Vitalik, I'm following like Coinbase, and like certain like leaders, key organizations in the space, and they have this really, I want to say almost like an activist mentality, but sometimes I feel like, and I don't know about them specifically, it feels almost performative. Like it's like you kind of have to, because so many people who are like inculcated into the Web3 world are sort of like anti-establishment. And if you are, ironically, part of the establishment, you kind of have to play to the crowd a little bit. Do you think that that's true?
I think it is. I think like the first wave of adopters were the anarchists. The second wave were the yield chasers, right? The speculators, the Wall Street guys that wanted to see price go up. I see it. I see it both ways. So yeah, I think that we're moving past that. I think people are really seeing the true value of blockchain as a technology and what it can solve, and people aren't caring so much about. Are you beating the drum of full decentralization?
They do care, right? It's weird.
They do care. I will say the first project I did in blockchain was to build a clearinghouse for a centralized equities exchange in Australia, right? We didn't sell that client on saying we are full decentralists. We sold them on the value of blockchain and what it could bring to their market.
Right.
And no one talks about that, but that's the reality. That was a very successful project, and more and more of those are happening. So we might not need to be so deep into the ethos.
Speaking of more things happening, you need to come back on the show so we can get more of you, because you are awesome. And just thank you for coming to the show, man.
My pleasure. Thank you.
On one hand, institutional investment will create wealth. Many people are going to receive significant income from the legitimacy that comes with having the biggest corporations in the world as your partners. But I can't help but feel that Satoshi Nakamoto would be less than impressed with the current state of his peer-to-peer reimagining of the world. Is Web3 a chance to start all over again without human selfishness and greed getting in the way? Or is it just the latest way for governments and corporations to get their cut? We'll see you next time on The Daily Drop.